Okay, we're going to finish off feedback and go back over some of the sort of practices associated with feedback. Again, feedback is crucial for learning, but the way we give the feedback is also really important. So some feedback is delivered inappropriately or is unnecessary, and some feedback is really, really useful. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at those concepts. So when we're thinking about providing feedback, then I guess how you position yourself in that teaching space is crucial. You want to make sure you've got a visual feed on what's going on. So often we'll talk about the teacher being active. With beginner teachers, they tend to focus on the next sort of activity or the next teaching point or where they're going to put the cones rather than thinking about what kind of feedback and information am I going to develop through this approach. If you're using a games for understanding approach, it's really important that when you set up the game, that's when the teaching begins, so that you may not be the person jumping in all the time, but you're certainly facilitating the learning. And as a facilitator, you've got to know, you've got to keep an eye on the thing, and you've got to make decisions about what's going on, what learning is occurring or isn't occurring, and how might you improve that. So if you've got your mind on the next activity or the next progression or how you're going to set up the cones, then you can't really be a facilitator of learning whilst that activity is occurring. So you end up becoming a kind of I guess, a setter up or a person who sets up activity but doesn't actually teach. And I see that a lot with beginners, standing around thinking about the next activity rather than actually facilitating learning. It doesn't mean you have to be in there yapping away the whole time, but it does mean you have to know what's going on during that particular activity. So I think it's really important then that as beginners, beginner coaches or beginning HPE teachers, that we don't lose sight of the fact that once we've set up the activity, that's where the learning is occurring, and it's the most crucial part of what we pay attention to. So don't set up an activity or a game and then switch off thinking the job's been done and all the hard work's been done and there's a really good game happening, and therefore make the assumption that lots of learning is occurring. So scan the room, look at what's happening, be active, be engaged, understand where the learners are at. And I always talk about using kind of 4 lenses to look through. Look at the lens from a technical perspective. How is the technical skills being performed? Look at it from a tactical perspective. How is the game or activity progressing tactfully? And do the players and are they picking up on tactics and tactical understandings? Look at it from a physical fitness perspective. Is it the game breaking down because players are not capable of jumping or running or maintaining speed? And then look at it from a social perspective to see, is there issues related to the game breaking down based upon relationships or teamwork or leadership or communication. And so think about those concepts when you're sort of analysing or looking at these particular activities. And I think if you do that, then this idea of actively monitoring and supervising practice becomes the role of the HPE teacher. And that will then lead to these teachable moments or these opportunities to step in and ask questions or do some teaching. So, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but the number of times I see instructors not have correct positioning so they can monitor performance is quite staggering. I like to use grids, so you can see there might be a 4-grid activity. So you need to position yourself where you can monitor and see all grids in action. So, this is a better perspective. It's the backs to the wall kind of field of view. But you might also want to move around. You might also want to, pay close attention to this group and give them some feedback, and then move across to this group and give them some feedback while they're thinking about applying it. And you work your way around the room. You come back to this group and say, right, how do we go? What did we do? What did we learn? How do we achieve this? And then move around again. So you can do that, providing that the group knows you're going to come back and check. Then they might be able to be on task and solve that problem before you get back to them again. So you don't always have to be in this position. So long as there's a task or something they know you're going to come back and observe them on, then that's a useful approach. So again, try never to turn your back on the activity. It's pretty hard, but think about monitoring where you can observe a range of things. Don't be predictable. Don't sort of direct your attention to one group and everyone else knows that you're not paying any attention to them for a significant period, because they will get off task relatively quickly. So providing you continue to monitor and scan, then that's going to be okay. Don't just focus on the good team or the better athletes and give them the critical feedback either. Make sure you move around and get to all learners and give all learners equal opportunity to receive feedback. It's a subtle form of discrimination when we give specific critical feedback to one subpopulation and general well done, keep trying kind of feedback to the rest, and they pick up on that and they realize they're not as important in your eyes. So just be aware of that. Look, I like the idea of being active and circulating, moving through. Don't be too brief that they don't get anything out of it. Don't be too long that the rest of the group gets off task. So that's a really good piece of advice. Don't be predictable. Sometimes predictable is okay if they know you're going to go to the next 3 groups, but get back to them and challenge them on what they've learnt. And being predictable, they know how much time they've got to achieve the task. They've got a fair idea of when you're going to come back and check, so they can kind of plan their responses and answers accordingly. So I think this is good advice, but not necessarily to be taken on all contexts. Proximity control is useful. So if you're miles away, then I guarantee you the group will get off task relatively quickly. Again, you want to ask yourself the question: if a group is getting off task, why? Is your activity boring? Is it disengaging? Is it not working? So making sure you're there so they're on task probably means, if that's the only way they're going to be on task, it probably means your activity's got some issues with it. It's not engaging, it's not meaningful. So I always think if kids are getting off task, it's not necessarily because you're not standing over the top of them watching what's going on. It's probably because the activity you've set up is not meeting their needs as learners, and therefore they're getting off task because it's boring. So ask yourself that question as well, and you may need to change it up or give it another a bit of a poke and get that activity really firing again. With itness, the idea of having eyes in the back of your head, again, it sounds like a surveillance. Like, I think this is taking a fairly strict surveillance approach to discipline management, and I would understand that if we're running pretty crappy standard PE classes, because kids get off task quite easily when you're not engaging them. However, if you run a really good, engaging, challenging, mastery motivational climate, you shouldn't have to be too stressed about having, ultimate visual and physical presence. Nonetheless, important points, and being aware of what's going on is going to be an important part of being a good coach. I mean, ideally, a good teacher or a good coach would be able to step outside the room and the team would still teach themselves. I mean, I think that's a nice ideal, and in probably junior sport it's achievable, but maybe not so much in a HPE curriculum, especially when you haven't yet got the art of developing a meaningful curriculum that all students can feel engaged in. I think that would be a nice goal. Okay, feedback frequency. This is something I really want to talk about. A lot of people think that giving more feedback more often is the best solution. It actually isn't. You can overdo it. It creates dependency. The learners forget to learn for themselves. They rely heavily on your feedback. They don't want to do anything without you giving them the green light, etc. So this idea of faded feedback, so the more a learner learns, the fewer amounts of feedback they receive, is a nice idea. So you can see here it's 100%, 50, 30, 20, whatever. The aim here is that you don't give feedback after every single trial. So the relative feedback frequency decreases and the absolute frequency fades. So we go from 10 to 5 to 3 to 2. So think about that as an approach. Obviously, early in learning, giving more feedback is important until they get the idea of the skill, but as they get the idea of the skill, you can start to fade that feedback out. And obviously, if you're working with elite athletes, you really don't need to give hardly any feedback on technique. The athletes should already know the correct technique, so it's more or less a question of challenging them to be aware of their own performance. When instructing groups, so you're going to be most likely instructing groups in a HPE context. So you're not going to be able to give individual feedback to all learners on all trials. So you're going to try and give, enough feedback to enough individuals so they feel like that you understand what they're doing and where their learning is at and what their learning needs are. So the challenge here is to be able to give enough feedback to individual learners, because often we'll leave individual learners out, and we typically do that on the basis of gender and ability and minority. So those we think are the most likely to be successful in sport, we tend to give the most constructive, useful feedback to, and those who we don't, we tend to give general or non-existent feedback to. Think about giving feedback as often as possible to as many learners as possible. Should be a kind of goal. But without, I think you can overdo feedback. I think you can get people turned off from overcooking it. So just be careful that you don't. It's not all about you. It's got to be about the learners learning, and as long as you have that as your focus, I think you'll be okay. The different hypotheses for why reduced or faded feedback is important. There's a guidance hypothesis where the learner just becomes completely dependent on feedback rather than using their own feedback. There's a consistency hypothesis. The learner makes too many corrections to movement, so they never really develop a stable movement pattern. And then there's an overload where they just get too much information and can't deal with it. So these are strategies then for manipulating feedback. I quite like, I often use a banded bandwidth feedback approach. So when I'm working with learners, obviously faded is a form of bandwidth feedback. So if you implement a bandwidth feedback, then you allow the learner to search for the right solution, the right movement solution within a predetermined range or tolerance limit. So what you don't want is a learner trying to learn a new skill and having absolutely no idea what to do. So they're on this kind of meaningless search process where they're trying to work out what the skill is and how to do it and whether they've vaguely got it right or not. So you'll have a set range. So you want them to step forward in opposition. You want them to have some sort of rotation, a backswing and a follow through. And if they're doing that, then you're going to let them go for a while until they perform outside of that bandwidth of correctness that you've set yourself. So it's kind of a limits, And if they seem to be on an aimless search and they're not improving through repeated trials, then you might want to step in and give some feedback to try and redirect them and get them back into a correct search pattern. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. So I think of it as a bit of a funnel. So long as they're bouncing around inside the funnel, that's okay. They'll search and refine and get more, get greater performance. If they're bouncing around outside the funnel, then I think you need to step in and give some feedback. Summary feedback is after a series of practice trials, trying to give an average of feedback. Sorry, wrong one. Summary is where you're going to give an optimal number of trials and then hit them with some feedback after that period of trials. I don't think we really know what the optimum number of trials is before you give feedback, so I tend to ignore that one. The average feedback is the one where you give a summary of performance over X number of trials and you work on the average of that performance. So, generally you stepped way too far to the left of the ball before you kicked it. And then so they need to think about that for the next series. This is an interesting one, the learner regulated one, where you just say to the learner, I'll give you feedback when you ask for it, so please ask for it when you think you need it, and then they will come to you when they think they want some feedback. And it's surprisingly how few trials they do that. They only want feedback on 7 to 11% of trials, which probably says that if you've been giving 100%, you're giving way too much because the learner just doesn't need it or want it. So it's an interesting one. And then even after they perform a good trial, it's just to reinforce whether they did it correctly or not. So creating an environment then where learners feel it, they can ask you to give them feedback, I think is really powerful. If you can get your students or learners in your coaching context to come up to you and ask you for feedback, then I think that's powerful, and it means they've got trust and respect. And it means you're not having to second guess, does this person want my feedback or not? So I think that'd be a really nice thing to work towards. Even if you're still using a bandwidth approach, having learners regulate feedback would be pretty important. And allowing them to do the same, not only of the coach, but of other players in the team. I mean, get the group to work as a team. So if you've got some skilled athletes and the other athletes want to learn from them, encourage them to go up and ask for feedback. Another interesting one, some people think you've got to give feedback immediately after the performance. It's not true. Just give a little bit of a delay so they can process their own intrinsic feedback and get their own analysis completed, and then you might want to step in at that point so they don't become dependent. That allows them to compare what they thought to what you think to see if they match. And so you're really teaching them to give themselves feedback in that process. Don't, who knows really, but just allow a few seconds for them to think about what happened before you jump in. Ask them a question. Ask them, what do you think of that one? And that'll, when they answer it, they've had enough time to process it. After feedback, how quick should they jump back in? Well, again, they've got to have enough time to understand the movement and have to understand the movement and then come up with a strategy or a new plan. So depending on what kind of challenge you put to them or question you've asked them or piece of feedback you've given them, they have to have enough time to process that and then go off and practice. So best to let them decide when they're ready to put it back into practice. Again, back to this group thing, I think peer feedback is a nice approach. Seidentop goes through a whole thing on peer feedback. The problem with peer feedback is they often don't know what they're looking for, so providing them with a task card or a sheet with the performance on it can be quite useful, because then they learn from that task card as well as give feedback. So instead of one coach or one teacher in the room, you've got 30 teachers potentially, and they're all working off a criteria that's a pretty standard checklist. So providing the skill itself or the movement itself has a kind of relatively easy thing to observe, and then you can see the criteria, then I think this works really nicely. So good for skill stuff. Probably a bit more difficult when it comes to tactical stuff, but if they're learning tactics, there's no reason you can't have peers give feedback on tactics. And then group or individual, sometimes giving individual feedback has a big impact on the whole group. So typically positive, don't berate anyone in front of everyone else, but give positive feedback, then the group can learn from that. If they've got an issue, an individual's got a technical issue or something that should be kept private, then do that privately, obviously. All right, so I think a couple of lessons from this one. Feedback should be faded or bandwidthed. Don't give too much too soon, and allow a bit of time for processing. Use student learner-centered techniques. Let them take responsibility for giving each other feedback and themselves feedback. Again, use video where they can critically analyze their performance and give themselves some feedback. I think they're all useful things. And most of all, be an active teacher. Don't be passive. And that may mean not actually talking, but at least you know what's going on, and you can then facilitate feedback in other ways. Okay, that'll do.